All right, welcome everybody. And it just so happens as soon as I started the live stream, something is burning. My wife is cooking cooking something in the kitchen, and she just set off the smoke alarm. So welcome everybody. Hold on, let me get out of here and switch into gallery view. All right, welcome those of you who are joining us on Zoom to today's presentation on hosting podcasts. 1 second, let me just, hold on. I got to start recording. There we go. So as I was saying, welcome to all of you who are joining us for this seminar on hosting podcasts. My name is Joseph Cohen. I'm a professor in the sociology department here at Queens College in the City University of New York. And I'm joined by some of my colleagues in the project. Jason Tuga, my co-director. Want to say hi, Jason? Introduce yourself. I think your mic is off.
Hi, Joe. Yeah, happy to be here as always, and I'm excited for your presentation.
All right. And Ryan Sperry from the sociology department at Queens College. Ryan, want to say hi?
Hi, how are you doing? Looking forward to the presentation. Thanks for having me.
And then we have some team members here, Anthony Borelli and Oscar Rosario. Let's put you on gallery view just so we can see the crew who is here. And welcome to everybody else who's participating. And so without further delay, why don't we get started? Before we get started, though, we got a couple messages to tend to, as always. First, stay up to date on all of our programming here at the Queen's Podcast Lab by signing up to our email list. You can join at queenspodcastlab.substack. At queenspodcastlab.substack.com. And there you can get access to the Zoom address and information on whatever programming we've got going. Jason and Anthony, can I make you guys my co-hosts just to make sure that people get in here? Just so I don't have, I'm going to make you.
Yeah, of course.
All right, thanks. I'm going to make it. Anthony, I'm going to put you on point for co-hosting.
Sounds good. I'll be looking for people.
Great. All right, let's get back to it. And all right, sharing the screen. So sign up to our news group. On October 27th, Wednesday, October 27th, join us for a discussion about celebrity and fame. What is it? How do people get it? How do people keep it? It is an outgrowth of some of the work that I'm doing with Ryan. Again, to join us, sign up for our email list, or you can RSVP by emailing me at joseph.cohen@qc.cuny.edu. In the coming weeks, we have more great programming, so put it on your calendar after the presentation on fame. We're bringing in some outside experts. Clayton Childress from the University of Toronto and Dana Weinberg are going to talk about the writing business. And then the following week, Hannah Wall from Berkeley is going to discuss creativity. She just put out a very well-regarded book on creativity. We're very excited to have her. And then on November 12th, Steve Von Doren from Von Doren Legal, that's a law firm that represents content creators specifically, will come in to talk about the legal issues that you have to contemplate or be aware of when you are engaging in content creation. I will tell you, of everything that I've learned since starting this project, the legal stuff was the biggest shock and the most important stuff, it turned out. Again, a very, very recommended session. But today we are going to be talking about the art and craft of hosting a podcast. And I want to start off by setting the stage with the original MC, the papal ceremoniere. All right. This is like the oldest, currently running or unbroken profession, maybe is the antecedent of the podcast host is the papal ceremoniere. And it is a person who is charged in the Vatican with orchestrating all of this ceremony that takes place involving the Pope. Okay, it's the person who is vested with the role of orchestrating the execution of a public event. And ceremoniaires, those who know them, apparently I've gone into the literature on this. There are some who are very well regarded. The stagecraft of the papacy is apparently a very big thing. I had no idea. And pictured here is a turn of the century ceremoniaire. Oh, I forgot his name. I don't have it, but he's very well regarded. But the thing that the reason I'm presenting the papal ceremoniaire to set the stage is to give you a sense of what hosting is at its root. Take a look at, some of the oldest instantiations of that profession. And this is one of them. A ceremoniaire is what we call a master of ceremony, an MC. And in podcasting, the host very much plays that role. What do podcast hosts do? Well, let's start off with by asking you guys. So I guess those of you who are here are interested in podcasting. When you envision yourself hosting, like what do hosts do? Are there any, what in your view, what does a host do? What's the role? What makes for a good host? If a host is doing their job well, what do they do? Anthony, go ahead.
In my opinion, a host is curating a story or giving away, not necessarily telling a story, but making sure that a story is being told or a conversation is going in a certain direction. They're curating, that's the word that just comes to my head, the events of the podcast, of the show, of the ceremony. They're making sure things are going according to plan.
All right. So it's like it's stagecraft. It's like directing the flow of events and making sure that they're going in the direction that you want.
Yeah.
All right. Oscar?
In the same vein, a host is somebody that's kind of like they're hosting an event. They're inviting other people along to just kind of see what they have to offer. They're the ones that are sort of like running this place. They're running the event. So while the guests are the ones that are somewhat the main focus of every individual episode, the host is the one that sort of like pieces it together. They're the one that provide the questions, make sure that it's going at a smooth pace, making sure everyone's voice is heard.
So it's like they're there to sort of ensure that the showcase, runs as planned, is accessible, is a place that you want to go to. Basically, is orchestrating the audience experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I like that. I like that a lot. Jason?
I was going to add that depending on the style of podcast and how big the enterprise is, the host is very much the tone setter. So creating a hospitable environment that will put guests at ease so that they want to open up and go places maybe they didn't even expect to go. And then on the other end, making it inviting for an audience.
Yeah, I love that. It is those things. So I wanted to start with two views on what hosts do. In terms of roles and where they are in the podcasting process, because in podcasts are often one-person enterprises or small enterprises where someone does everything. And I wanted to pinpoint exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about hosting, because hosting is only one of the many jobs that has to be done. So one way to think about hosting is it's a role in a creative enterprise, right? So when you have a creative enterprise, there are people who put on different hats, right? There's an executive producer who runs the organization, hires the people, works on setting the larger tone of the enterprise. And then there are producers. These are people who might conceive and shepherd individual shows or segments. They help with the research, they do the booking, they might do the editing after the fact. And the host, now often many of the creators that Ryan and I come into contact with play the role of executive producer, and host. But the host, very specifically in multi-person operations, is a type of performer. It is sort of the face of the individual shows and of the series. And it's a type of performance job in which you create the raw material from which the final episode will be stitched together. And then finally, there's the sound engineer, which is where a lot of our interns are right now, working the programs, making sure it sounds good, putting the audio together. So you can think of it as a role. It's a performative role. And I think everybody's keyed into that, right? It is an organizational role, at least organizational in the studio. The other way to think about it is as a specific role that is part of the larger podcast creation process. And I find it helpful to think of it like this. A host job is to generate the content from which the final show will be created, right? So when you are a host, you're not really putting on a live show, but rather your job is to create the raw materials from which an excellent episode will be created, either from your own performance or by setting the stage so that the guest can produce something of value. Concretely, the jobs that hosts do, there are lots of different jobs that a host can take. There are different ways that podcasts can be organized, but my sense is that all of their jobs, there are at least 4 basic functions that hosts play or commonly play in a podcast enterprise. So the first thing that they do is, hold on. The first thing that they do is they write and develop content. So in podcasts, the host will often play a role in writing the content if there's any scripted material. And even if they don't write the scripts, hosts will often have to adapt the scripted material to make sure that what they're supposed to say is adapted to their performance strengths or their performance styles. So even if a podcast host isn't writing all of the material, they will have a role in the writing process by making sure that the script is something that they can work with, something that sounds good coming out of their mouth, something that reflects the voice that they're trying to establish. And then in a lot of cases, podcasts generate the raw material from which they're created. They do it through improvisation. They do it improvisationally. And in that sense, a podcast creator is very much part of writing the material, but it's a different type of skill. In addition to helping shape what is said, a podcast host shapes the how things are said or the feel and the pace of an episode, and that's what I think that's what Jason was coming from partly in his comments. Podcasters or the podcast host is a performer. It's a character on the stage. It is part of the experience that draws people to a podcast. It's part of what people attach, how people attach to a podcast. Shows have personalities, and you as a podcast host will be the biggest factor in creating the personality of that show. So you're a performer in addition to being a content developer. The third important role that hosts do is they direct the recording session. So often it is the job of the host to make sure that interactions are orderly, right? That everybody isn't talking at the same time, that people are talking on topic, that things aren't meandering. They also play a role in establishing the pace and the tone of the recording session. And a big part of it, at least for me, I found, is coaching and putting your co-performers at ease. The podcast, especially when you interview people who are not professional performers themselves or used to being in the media, part of the job that you have as a podcast host is finding a way that so that your guests can shine, so that your guests can give their best material, contribute the best that they have to offer. Because the better the raw material, the better the episode. And then finally, and this is one that's in the literature, I don't know about it as much, and I don't know what to think about it, but I'm going to put it in there. For many podcast scholars, they see hosts as playing a very important role in audience relations. Like they're the human face of the franchise. They are the person who is a stand-in for everybody who is doing work on a show. And they're a point of contact for the audience. So in a way, you're like the show's ambassador. You're who people gravitate to, and you are you are a spokesperson for it, and what people feel of you, those feelings will move on to the podcast enterprise. So you want to be able to develop positive relationships because you play a role in that. So the first thing is, what do podcasters do? To review, the first piece, they write the content, they are performers, they direct the recording sessions, and they act as the public face of a franchise. And so as a host specifically, not when you're wearing your producer's hat or your executive producer's hat or your sound engineer's hat, but when you're wearing your host hat, those are 4 of the big tasks that you are responsible for. Let me stop here and just ask if any of my collaborators have comments or anything to add. Did I miss anything on what podcast hosts do? Is there anything in there you think to add or to comment on?
I could offer one.
Yeah,
I
please.
feel like it's important for a host to do some research and keep the content fresh and relevant, because it's your job to, as the host, not only are you writing the script, but you should also piece together the information that you should be gathering. You have to know what you want to ask guests for when they get brought on.
Absolutely. There's we're going to go to that point, because it's a very good point, and it's one that I definitely believe it's true. Before we move on, though, well, let me ask you this. Let's move to the next question, because I think it's sort of Oscar's comment is a good springboard. Hold on, I just lost my Zoom. I just lost the Zoom toolbar. Don't you hate when that happens? All right, there we go. Let me ask you this, your opinions. How do you host well? Is there a right way to host and a wrong way to host? And what do you feel distinguishes good hosts from your run-of-the-mill host? Let me go back to the discussion. Does anybody want to share information on someone who they love, or what type of podcaster they like listening to? Do you feel like there's not a right way to host? What's your view, Oscar?
I feel like one way that's definitely good to host is just knowing how to go with the flow. Obviously, scripted is obviously important, but you can't just try to control exactly how you want this podcast to go. If a discussion goes one way, you just gotta flow with it. Otherwise, it'll feel stilted and just kind of a little robotic. And nobody wants to hear a bunch of robots talk. They want to hear people talk.
Going with the flow, making sure that the show isn't about the podcaster. And
of course, it's about the guests that you bring on.
I like that. I think that's true. Any other views on what differentiates a good from a bad podcaster, or a good host from a bad host, in your view? Any views? Oh, Jason?
I would just build on what Oscar's saying. First of all, it's a matter of taste. So there's some things you like, some some things you don't. I won't name this person, but there's a podcast host whose voice I find incredibly irritating. But the person is very well prepared and has really, like, the narratives are excellent. And so I still manage to be in, so there can be kind of pros and cons. I will say the one thing I like, building on Oscar's first comment, is being informed to me is make or break. There are all these podcasts out there where it's like, we're a bunch of friends and we think our opinions are interesting and we're going to sit around and talk about it. That's so boring.
Yeah.
I want somebody to know something.
So for definitely preparation is extremely important. And a lot of what comes across to the listener as improvised or off the cuff material is in fact has some very substantial planning elements to it. And the improvisation is happening along a much narrower band of, topics or issues than you might realize. I'm going to show you how I go about doing that in my own podcast. But in general, it's before I continue, I will say that when you read up on podcasting or when you go to other seminars, I think there are many people who have a very strong view of there's a right way to do this and a wrong way to do this. For example, Jason and I, we went to peek in on a seminar on vocal techniques for podcasters. And we had a guy tell us that we should all be talking in a calm, natural NPR way. That's what I gathered, at least. He was like, yeah, you don't want to sound radio announcer-ish, no, WCBS coming at you for this. But like, my sense of his advice, and when we've interviewed people with media experience in the project with Ryan, it's been my experience that people who come at podcasting from a big organization or from legacy media have a very strong view, have stronger views about how people should or should not do things. And I have a theory that part of the reason they do that is because they are used to working in an environment with very strong externally imposed editorial or performative guidelines. And those guidelines are already designed to satisfy an existing audience. So that chill NPR sound is probably great for the people who listen to NPR, right? But I don't know if that's good always. I could imagine a lot of scenarios where like some peppy radio announcer voice is effective or does draw people in. So I don't know if there are so many hard and fast rules, and I know people have them, but here's my opinion, and feel free to disagree with me. Sorry, I'm having a delay here. In my view, there are only two absolute necessities, and I didn't put preparation in here, but I'll explain why in a second. I think it is possible to have something improvised that's good, at least once in a while, but without preparation, you're just hoping to win a lotto ticket or pull it off. It's like giving that speech at school when you didn't do the homework. Like once in a while, you might pull it off, but like you should always be preparing. And Jason, I think I should even have this on it, but here's what I think are two big necessities. One is clear, distraction-free speaking, and two is the capacity to orchestrate usable moments. Let me explain. So for speaking, I feel like the only rule is that you should not impose a job on your listeners to listen to. You should not give them reasons to, find it difficult to hear what you're saying. So clear speech is just clear articulation, trying to get rid of distracting noises or aspects of your speech that might pull people's attention away from the topic of the show or what you're trying to say. And then you have to develop the ability to develop orderly lines of thinking in your own speech and orderly discussion when you're managing other people. So rather than just being meandering and letting people interrupt and just making it a battle royale free-for-all, hosting well involves the ability to create a recording session that generates a conversation that people can follow, that has a main point, that isn't hard to listen to, that isn't annoying in some way. Although Jason makes the point that sometimes there are people whose speaking styles you don't like and you listen anyways. Do you want to add anything to that, Jason, or disagree or qualify?
No, I think that's right. The one thing I would just emphasize is that the word distraction there, I think, is key. And one way to think about anything about a podcast is this thing engaging or is it distracting? And where something's distracting, that's where you want to work differently or you want to do something in post, and I think just keeping that in mind is a great rule of thumb.
I think that's true. Yeah, distraction, because distraction is pulling you off the activity that you've convened people to come experience. Then the second thing is a good host has the capacity to orchestrate usable moments, right? And this is where preparation comes in, and we'll talk about it. But that means you delivering a strong performance, you being a person on stage who people like, who does something that's meaningful, who does something that rewards, like adds something that makes coming to the podcast worth the audience's time. It can stem from improvising quality moments. Now, when I say usable or quality moments, what I mean is you're creating moments on the audio recording where in post-production, people are like, oh, that's great. We got to include that. That was funny. That was informative. That was rewarding somehow. So what you're doing in the recording session is you're trying to create moments that reward the listener. And you can think of it as you're creating candidates for whoever's doing post-production to choose. It doesn't all have to be great. It's okay if a joke doesn't land. It's okay if a question doesn't work out, because all of that can be taken out in post-production. It's not a live stage show. So remember, you're creating raw materials, and there's some concrete implications to that. For example, you can talk to the guest on real time. It's not a live show. So if you go to backstage talk with the guest, you're like, hey, would you like to tell this story now? Or, hey, would it be interesting for us to discuss this? The guest could be like, yeah, I'd love that. Or I have a good story that I'd like to tell. And you just take that out and pretend like it came up organically in post-production. So remember, you're not in a live performance when you're hosting. You're in a recording session. And you're not creating the whole show by yourself. You're collaborating with whoever does post-production. So what you should be focused on is creating good moments from which a good final cut of your episode can be developed. But beyond those basics, I think you have a lot of latitude. I think it is my personal view, and this is just a personal view, so take it with a grain of salt, that given that media is fragmenting so much, we're all all of our attention is spreading to these really micro-targeted specialty outlets. Who knows what will attract people and what won't? We don't have to have huge audiences. You just want audiences who love you, and who knows what there's going to bring. So give yourself the ability or the latitude to experiment, try weird things, try different things. My advice to you is, one, start with your authentic self. Start with who you are. One, because you can't fake it. And two, because everybody has something interesting, and audiences who gravitate towards you will probably be somewhat like people who would gravitate towards you in real life. So, but you want to be a little more polished than you are. You want to speak a little more articulately, maybe, a little more clearly, a little more professional, but still be yourself. Take risks, and remember that your unique character will help define the series of the franchise. So, part of who you are will be part of your podcast. So be who you are, and then just see who gravitates towards your franchise. Now, over time, your hosting persona within a series will evolve, right? You're not the same person in every series. Who you are, your persona in a series partly depends on the series. And start with your authentic self. Start by asking, what would I like to talk about if I were to meet this guest? What would I like to ask if I, that's how I do it. And then just experiment with who you are. And over time, you will figure out, what attitude or personality you want to project, or what speaking or performance style works for you. What rhetorical devices can you use that will help get you through interviews and help contrive good material, and developing general interview techniques. A lot of people talk about authenticity, but that doesn't mean that you can't learn from others, right? So listen to other people and borrow tricks you like. It's not fake to learn from experienced people, and it's not inauthentic for you to adopt stylistic decisions that you appreciate, right? Like, you're not going to go in and try to be Tim Ferriss. You're not going to go in and do an exact replicate of Terry Gross. But like, if Terry Gross does something and you like it, well, use it. You won't like everything that Terry Gross likes. And the things that you do like about Terry Gross are partly a reflection of what you like because you chose to gravitate towards them. Margaret writes, I think Terry Gross of NPR is excellent. She prods the guest, but she's polite. I love Terry Gross too, right? But there are other formats where maybe politeness wouldn't work. Sometimes there are some hard debating shows where everybody's like edgy and at each other. And that's, the audience must want some type of discussional bloodbath. And so the franchise will deliver it, right? So you want to emulate what you like of people, but you also want to make sure it fits what you're going for. And if you like Terry Gross and you like somebody who's polite, I'm guessing, Margaret, you're somebody who's polite, and you like that type of discussion. And if you were to run a podcast, you would run it like that as well, because that's who you are. You're gravitating towards what you like. At least that's my suspicion without knowing you very well. One thing's for sure, and Jason makes this point, you need to be prepared. People who are not prepared in a recording session will babble. Their individual statements will often be more aimless. The course of the discussion will often be more aimless. And it will look less like a carefully choreographed staging, and it will look more just like some random collection of people getting together. I have a couple tips for preparation. Then I'm going to show you how I do it. The way I do it is not the way to do it. It's just what's worked for me. All right. So a couple tips. Hold on before this comes up. So a couple tips. You should always be prepared. Always. And start by knowing the show. Okay. Your preparation should be oriented towards creating a show that is consistent with the show's general format, what the show tries to achieve in general. You should be preparing to speak to the interests of people who listen, who to listen to the show. So start your show prep by knowing the show, understanding the show. The other thing to think about going into preparation is to understand the episode's goals. Generally you'll be the one who planned the show, but if you worked with a producer, ask the producer, what is their goal? Also, learn about the guest. Why is the guest here? What does the guest want to accomplish? Being sensitive to those things will help you create an environment where the guest can be at their best and the guest walks away satisfied. And at least in my field, for my show, I serve a pretty closed community, and the guests who I draw from all know each other. They're all sociology academics. And so reputation is very important. If you maintain a reputation that people walk away satisfied from your show, you will not have as much trouble getting guests in the future. but it's easy to get a bad reputation and be in a situation where, you either have to draw from a pool of people who have no way of ever having heard of you, or people who don't care. Talk to your guests, ask questions, seek their input. And the first step, so once you have that information, what I do at least is I start with a general sense of where I want to go in the episode, what interests me, what will interest my audience, and I'll try to get an understanding of what needs to be covered. And then from that general roadmap, I think of questions, topics, monologues, anecdotes. Let me give you a concrete example. So this is a depiction of a process that I went through in preparing for an interview with a guest called Adam Slez. And Adam is an expert on 19th century populism. So he's a political historian. And Adam wrote a book on populism, American populism in the 19th century in the Midwest. Okay. And I was interested in it because of Trump. I was like, oh, wow, we could learn about populism. Maybe we can get some, window into Trump by asking how populism occurred in the past. That was my personal interest. So I was aware of that. And then I thought, well, what would my audience like? My audience would, I know my audience well, and that's an important part of hosting. I know they care about methodology. So I put that on my, to-do list. And I wanted to give Adam the chance to talk about his book. So you create a brainstorm list of ideas, and then you try to think of a sequence of it. So I came up for my interview with Adam, I decided on 4 steps. The first step always is setting up the episode by making sure that people, in my podcast at least, so by making sure that people understand basic terms or they understand the basic concept so they can follow. It's just a way of getting everybody on the same page. So all of my episodes, it's formulaic. I start off by setting the stage for everybody. And then strategically at the second stage, I went into the history of populism. And the main reason I did that was I knew that Adam was doing a lot of book talks and I wanted to put him at ease. And I knew that Adam wanted to talk about the book. So I wanted to basically get Adam, my guest, started by talking about something that he's comfortable with, by making sure that what Adam wanted to get out of the episode was there at the start. And I wanted to create a situation where, Adam was comfortable and happy. And I wanted to get us towards, a loose, engaged discussion. And that's the method that I chose in planning that episode. The third part, I spoke about methodology in part because I thought it would be it's just part of my mandate. We like to talk about methodology, and I figured that would be sort of the slowest one. I kept it short, but I wanted it in there. And then finally, I ended with Trumpism because I thought that's what interested me. I think a lot of people would have been waiting to hear about it, and Trump was a topic that could have gone in any number of directions. And then I thought we could just go for it. So do you see what I'm doing there? Take a look at what I'm doing. So I had a guest, I had my own goals, and I knew what the guest wanted, and I knew what my audience likes. I brainstormed a list of steps that the discussion could take, and then I settled on 4 big steps or segments in the interview. And that gave me a roadmap. And I talked to Adam before, gave him the opportunity to, chew on stuff, think about it. But there was a path. And because I had a path, I was able to direct the discussion because I knew where we were going. And then after that, what I do is I set up a script, but I don't go by the script. What I do is, so if you take a look, I just did a screenshot. I was trying to be stylized, but I guess I didn't do a good job. So up here, can you see this on the screen? So this is part of the introduction. This is where I start off all of my episodes by talking about why I invited the person and what I thought was interesting. So that part I was reading, that was pure script. And then what I did under that, this is the first step, where I established the common ground. And I listed out questions. And I didn't read them in order. It was more like there was a pool of questions that I could draw to, and I just picked what felt right at the moment. So I didn't go through a script in a hard way, but rather I created a pool of questions from which I could draw on my feet, or some anecdotes or some comments that I could draw on while the recording was going on. So for example, here I have a question, what is populism? But then I came up with a little bit and I just made a decision. I forget if I used it or not. Okay. For each step in the path, I'll try to think of questions, stories, anecdotes, discussions. Just try to get a mix of stuff, because you're managing an interaction rather than acting out a script. And then what you do is you let that pool of questions and that roadmap be your guide. I want to stop there. So are there any questions so far on show prep at this phase? I would say, hold on, let me just make sure here. Any comments? Hold on. Jason.
Yeah, thinking of Terry Gross, I think it's really instructive to listen to the variety of prompts she gives her guests. And I say prompts because it's not all questions, right? And she occasionally asks a long question, but most of them are quite short. So like, she had Questlove on this last week. He has a new book out, this amazing book that's
Nice.
called Music as History. Each year uses a song, for each year he uses a song as a lens for thinking about that year of his life. Nice. And these are hypothetical, but she varies things like, for example, I mean, here's one question she could vary a few ways that she tends to do. So you grew up in a show business family. What was that like? Or you grew up in a show business family. Tell me about that. She often says, tell me about that. Or she could simply say, you grew up in a showbiz family, and see what he says, right? Huh. Or, you know, for the year 1988, you talk about Public Enemy's Fear of a Black Planet. Stop, right? And then see what happens. If you're not always asking a very directive question, you'll get surprising things out of your guest, right? And that's where I think when you're talking about show prep, the host at that point is in a combination of roles, producer and interviewer. And those aren't exactly the same thing. Some shows have separate people doing those jobs, right? So I think it's useful to think about that. And then also, because I'm teaching podcasting, I'm hearing from my students quite a bit. If you're not a person who's done much public speaking, I'm hearing from them that it's actually takes an enormous amount of practice for them to sound like themselves.
Huh. What do you mean by that? Like,
their inclination is to overperform.
Yep.
Or hold back. You know, one of those two things. A lot of them are doing, and they don't like it. Right. So then they're sort of practicing finding the thing that actually sounds to them like a person they recognize, you know, but
that's awesome. That's all, you know, but I think that's what I was trying to get at when I was like, just let your persona develop, like be patient with yourself.
Yeah.
You know, chances are, even though you feel you sound a little bit robotic, it's fine. You know, you don't hate on, you've heard people speak a little bit robotic. It doesn't destroy, you know, the experience, and you'll get better, you know, and it's also like people, again, I think we talked about this in a previous session. Most people are very forgiving And you'll find that most people have something nice to say, and it's very easy to get fixated on maybe the one jerk who says something, but like, don't. Ryan, you want to say something?
Yeah, all of this is so interesting because I didn't really think about interviewing in these ways that you guys are talking about it. But then when you speak of it in these terms, it really makes me realize why I like certain interviewers like Terry Gross, right? I know we keep coming back to her, but she's kind of like the goat of, interviewing, right?
Yeah.
And the greatest of all time, I mean, right? And the one thing that she does that, Jason was just pointing out too, the way she leads people, I think there's a couple of things she does that are really great. And maybe this is related to her being comfortable with her public speaking self, that she puts everyone at ease. Everyone seems so comfortable when they're interviewing with her, right? And then that allows them to, with her prompts, to get them to open up about stuff that they're not really originally there for, right? Like she will get the content of a book just so the viewers know what's going on, but then she always gets something extra out of them. Maybe it's like, oh, you grew up in that family. What was that like? That maybe wasn't in the book, right? But maybe it was, but it gets something extra out of them. And I think that your last slide had a lot of that too, right? The way you laid it out, I think was great. You kind of got the essence of the book, then you kind of get them comfortable talking about what they're comfortable about. And then you kind of introduce the connection to Trump, which was something extra maybe that wasn't in the book. So I think there's a lot of formula here. I never really thought about it until you guys laid it out. Now, that being said, I think there's, as you said, there's styles that are different, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Terry Gross doing sports radio would not work. In fact, I find it infuriating when NPR talks about sports because they just don't do it right, or if ESPN talks about politics, if they don't do it right. So there is something about the style there that's across that doesn't always work for everything. That's just my...
Jason.
Yeah, just to go on with Terry Gross for a minute. She does an interview on Jesse Thorne's podcast, The Turnaround, which is where he interviews famous interviewers. And it's interesting to hear her talk about how her persona has evolved over time, and really making Joe's point. And she talks about, and we hear a little bit of older NPR footage from her where she does sound quite different, actually, and not nearly as loose. And then she describes some examples of early work she did that was bad. But it's also interesting to notice the interplay between Jesse Thorne and Terry Gross, because Terry Gross, she might reveal a little bit about herself during an interview, like something like she'll say, "I'm short," or something, or occasionally she might be like, "I have a husband," but she's not telling you her painful emotional experience, right? But Jesse Thorne, it intros the show by saying, "I had a migraine that day. I was interviewing my hero. I was mortified. I think I probably did a terrible job. I can't listen to it." Right? And he, like a few times, he kind of apologizes to Terry Gross during the interview. And he pulls it off because it's part of his persona, that it's able to do that. He reveals himself in general. So just to note that there's not a question of what's right or wrong. It's a question of what fits. Works.
Also, like the one thing that you mentioned with Terry Gross that I wish I had given more examples was when we were talking about rhetorical tacks that you can assume. Yeah. Like just the statement without a question, just laying down a statement. That's a rhetorical tactic, right? That is a way of developing a communication that is designed to discombobulate or provoke something, but she's asking things in a strategic way. And the more podcasters you listen to, or the more you pay attention to the art of interviewing, you'll pick up tricks. I remember once, for example, I was listening to a sports podcast and somebody made an outlandish claim. And the co-host was like, "Do you really believe that?" And it really threw the guest off, and then they started doing it. And I was like, "Oh, I totally got to try the "do you believe it" move in my podcast." And it totally worked. And I'm not saying like the "do you believe it" move is it in and of itself not a great move, but the point is to see these things as moves, to see them as like tricks or hacks or tacks, and try them out for yourself. Because again, what you're trying to do is create interesting moments, is to create super moments. And as a host, that's why you can't do it formulaically. Like there's a human element to this. And what works for me will not work for other people. So you also have to think about what works for me, right? Like, I'm sure if I was like a super handsome guy or whatever, I could be flirty and that would work. It would be very bad in my situation, in my podcast, doing research in that type of environment. So there's no hard and fast tricks. You got to figure out tricks that work for you, that help build your persona. Jason, is your hand up or okay? Just taking that. I wanted to just make this point. It is true that a good show is about the guest. However, there have been times where a guest for me has not panned out as well as I hope. Sometimes you get guests and they're great when they're in written form and you meet them and you're like, oh, you're not a conversationalist. In a way, a host can be a backup, and I underscore backup performer, in the sense that when I go into an episode, I try to have some original material that has some redeeming value. I try to create a setup that has a nugget that might be illuminating or thought-provoking or might be funny. I try to think of stories that I can tell that the audience might enjoy or might find funny in and of themselves. And so if the guest is someone who fails to generate a lot of quality material, and that happens, maybe at least your material will have some redeeming value. Now, that's a risky move. It's a move that you can do. Well, I don't know. It's a risky move, but you're putting yourself out there. And in some measure, I think podcast audiences go there for the host. And so think of yourself, you don't want to be the primary content producer. There's nothing worse than a host who has a show about themselves. But think of yourself as a backup performer, someone who can just stick some nuggets in there to maybe either spice up an already great dish or to, I don't know, you know what they mean. But yes, Oscar.
I mean, just depending on the guest, some people just sort of feel more comforted if they, it's the difference between like making somebody feel like they're just having a conversation versus we're live on stage. Get ready. You're going to be speaking to thousands of people and we want to know exactly what you want to know. So how is it with the camera just sort of pushed into their face as they're talking? Obviously it's that part where you're trying to make them feel comforted, but by the end of the day, being a good backup performer is letting them know, we got backup. You're not doing this alone.
Yep. Sometimes too, listen, you can tell a story and if your host finds it funny or thought-provoking, it might cause them to follow up. Like if the material that you're bringing, if the anecdotes, the stories, the questions are good, chances are the guest is going to like them too, or at least there's a chance the guest will like them. And if you can expose the guest to sort of a new tack or something and they enjoy it and it provokes them to talk, well, that's how you can get that heated up discussion, right? That's how you can get that free flowing discussion. Let's see. Jason, do you want to
I just put a link in the chat to an alternative style of editing that can sometimes deal with the question of whether the guest was vibrant or not. And this actually, in this episode, I don't think that was the issue, but it's pretty interesting what they do here. So Switched on Pop is a pop music podcast hosted by a songwriter and a musicologist whose names are Nate Sloan and Charlie Harding. And they did an episode on BTS, the K-pop group's big summer hit Butter. And they're analyzing it from a musicology perspective. And then they bring in the primary songwriter. And they're not all in a room with her having a discussion. And so they edit it like this. They say things like, her name's Jenna Andrews. Jenna told me how the process got started. and then they just let her talk for a while, right? And they've edited out entirely their part of the conversation, have re-recorded it and edited it together, and then they do something else. In the second half of it, BTS has like huge super fans who are also content creators of the K-pop world, right? They make so one of the creator roles is translator, so somebody who translates the music from Korean to other languages, and they introduced this super fan by saying one of BTS's super fans has called us out because we've only done episodes on their English hits. And so she's right, and we decided to talk to her. And then something happens there that's really important is these two white guys now have a Korean guest who's a super fan and a translator who becomes the expert and is schooling them on
Nice.
what you know. But again, they edited it that same way. They don't pretend they're talking to her live. They edit it in by saying, Bora told us about why translators are so important in the K-pop world, and then it's just some audio of her saying that. So
that's nice. One, I love that because it's true. Again, like the interview is the raw material, and you can spin it a bunch of ways, and you should always have the availability of post-production in mind for sure. Mm-hmm. And then I also I also believe in having a very humble attitude going in, because humility, it makes you interesting. And just about everybody has interesting knowledge that I don't possess. Everybody has something interesting piece of knowledge that I don't possess, or a view that has merits over mine. And I think it's always great, even when you have just a super fan. I'm sure they got something. And if they don't come up with anything, you can cut them out in post-production anyways. So it's like no lose. I love that. That's a cool concept. So I put I on YouTube, I also reposted that. Great mention. All right, we're running out of time. I just have a couple other points on hosting. Always remember, okay, so a couple more points. One, always remember that coaching guests is part of the job. Your episodes will work best when you find a way to get people to give you their A material, right? That's how I always see it. Like, I always feel like I have an author and they got some great material locked up in there, and I have to find a way to contrive the experience of the recording session to get them in an emotional place, to get them in a mental place where they're going to give me all their best stuff and come up with some great stuff. Give me their best improvisational efforts. They'll give me the best delivery. They'll mine their, they'll put in the most effort. Make sure, though, don't assume that your guests know what to do. Guests can often be very nervous, and it's very helpful to just tell them, not just before the recording session, but during the recording session. Tell them that they can interrupt anytime. Be like, listen, you're not live. This is all in post-production. You can ask me a question anytime. You don't want to talk about something, let me know. We'll take out whatever you don't want. And I find that puts guests in more of a place of ease. And check in with them during the recording session, and don't be afraid to ask them what direction they think the podcast discussion should take. You're co-creating, so think of it as your guest. You're bringing somebody in, and you're making a show together. It's different from a live event because you can take away all that backstage talk. Take advantage of that. The other thing to remember is to know when to fold them, and what I mean by that is, when you record a podcast, it will feel very different from how a podcast sounds. And it's the difference between a rough draft and a published draft of a book, right? And what will happen is you'll be talking with people, and then eventually, when you get to the part of the discussion where everybody's like, yeah, and you got nothing else to say, and it just peters out. Sometimes, well, the experience of that I have found can distress audiences. They feel like they did something wrong when a discussion peters out, and you got nothing to say. But that's so not the truth. The truth is that I always edit out essays to discussion points to end them while they're running hot. And I introduce the next topic right after. And so it gives the impression of a really intense discussion where people just were fully engaged and nothing petered out in the whole hour. But really the session was an hour and a half. And I got rid of all of the bad moments, or the moments when people just ran out of stuff to talk about. So let discussion topics run their course. When a conversation dies down, go into your repository of anecdotes and questions and pull something else out. And then when you feel you've run out of topics, wrap up the session. Remember, it's not a live show. You can take out all of the awkward silences. And then finally, the last point to make, and then we'll adjourn, is remember, the host is the face of the franchise. There are many people who go in to who contribute to making a show like the Joe Rogan Experience or Fresh Air with Terry Gross. When we imagine it, we think Terry Gross is doing everything personally and that the show's her. And because we tend to personalize our relationships with media people that we interact with. We tend to imagine them as personal relationships, and we draw analogies between how we would interact with people in everyday life and the media we consume. But like Terry Gross is the face of a franchise. Joe Rogan is the face of a franchise. They're not involved in every decision. They don't do every job, but they are there. And as ambassadors of the franchise, there's a lot of things that you can do to forward the franchise: social media, crossover events. What I mean is appearing on other people's podcasts, writing blogs and things like that, and doing other promotional stuff. So I think I'll stop there. Does anybody have anything else to add? Anybody on the panel? Any comments, questions, anything I missed, anything you disagree with?
Sometimes I just think a podcast should just be fun, depending on obviously what the purpose is. If you're trying to run like a professional, more business related thing, you do you and you do what's important. But if it's just something on a light subject, there's just enjoy it. No point in running a show if you just feel passionless about it.
That's for sure. Although always prepared, right?
Oh yeah, definitely.
It's like the fun, but it is, and it can look spontaneous, but there should be careful orchestration. But I have to say, I think Ryan will agree with me. Podcasting and other Web 2.0 platforms like blogging and YouTubing and things like that, the number one thing that keeps franchises alive is the creator's passion to keep creating. And you won't want to create unless you're having a good time. So always make sure that you enjoy it, because you won't last if you don't enjoy it. Any other comments or anything to add? Ryan, Jason, Anthony, Bernard, Margaret? Well, all right. So let me just finish off with a message. All right. So hold on. Waiting for my share screen to activate. All right. So a final word. This presentation is part of the Queen's Podcast Labs Learning Series. These are free educational resources that are brought to you by the state and city of New York. These are your tax dollars at work. Our work creates free public resources, non-commercial scholarly media content, and a great educational experience for young New Yorkers who aspire to careers in fields like media, marketing, entertainment, culture, and much else. If you want to support the kind of work that we do, whether it's online learning like this, our podcasts, or the internship program, please visit our site, queenspodcastlab.org, and click donate. Your tax-deductible donation to our project goes through the Department of Sociology at Queens College in the City University of New York. And not only does it help us create these things, but it communicates to our superiors at the university that people value what we are doing. And so that concludes our presentation. I'm going to end the live stream. So to all of you on YouTube, thank you for joining us. We hope to see you on October 27th, and take care. All right, the live stream is done.